Hi, good morning, and welcome to today's episode of Thinking Constellationally. I'm your host, Stephanie Senna, and on this show, we talk about how to make connections between systems of inequity and between ourselves and our neighbors. This is USALA Media, and today with me, I have two special guests, Lindsay Schoonmaker and Liz Tarlowski. And these two guests are lawyers with the nonprofit VIP. And they do work with tenants who are facing or have faced evictions. So we're going to be talking today a lot about evictions, housing, and homelessness, and kind of destigmatizing these issues and raising awareness about what the public should know and do to support people who are in a vulnerable situation when it comes to housing. So thank you so much, Lindsay and Liz, for being with us today.
Absolutely, we're happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you.
I'd love to start by hearing a little bit about you and what your background is and what motivated you and brought you to this work. So if I could start with Lindsay first, and then I'll hear from Liz.
Sure. So I was not entirely sure what I wanted to do when I graduated from undergrad, but was considering being a lawyer. So I worked as a paralegal for 4 to 5 years doing immigration law, and I loved working with lawyers and helping people with their legal issues. Was not so sure that I wanted to be an immigration lawyer, but found it very fascinating because things change all the time. You're constantly learning. And had a lot of contact with the healthcare system, thought I maybe wanted to be a patient advocate, but went to law school because at a certain point as a paralegal, I wanted to be promoted and help people even more. So I went to law school, focused a lot on healthcare issues, and when I graduated, I actually worked at a law firm, but I did a lot of pro bono work, and my pro bono work was focused on housing in some respects, but also on healthcare issues, but they're so tied together. Having stable housing is so important to someone's health that I really got pushed more towards general civil issues. Landlord-tenant is one of those. So I did a lot of pro bono work and made my way into the public interest community in Philadelphia, which is really wonderful, and started doing sort of all general civil work. At Philadelphia VIP, we do sort of A to Z adoption to zoning of the civil world, focusing especially on housing, preserving income, family stability, and then we have a program that does community and economic development for small businesses and nonprofits.
Amazing. And VIP, I mentioned, is a nonprofit.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me what VIP stands for?
It doesn't stand for anything anymore. It originally was Philadelphia Volunteer for the Indigent program.
Oh.
We've focused the name more just on Philadelphia VIP, but what our mission is to connect volunteer attorneys with people who could not afford a lawyer or find a free lawyer any other way. So all of our clients are at or below 200% of the federal poverty guidelines. And then we as a staff don't do direct services, but we recruit and support volunteer attorneys through the cases.
Okay, amazing. And to your point about housing is healthcare, so vital. And in fact, there are some pilot programs in different states right now where hospitals are recognizing that they have these group of super users, people who are experiencing homelessness, who take up about 90% of their financial and staff resources. And so they've determined that the hospitals, if they're private hospitals, can cut down on their costs if they actually pay rent for people who are experiencing homelessness. And once you pay rent for somebody, or you make sure that somebody is housed, because housing is healthcare, they end up needing to use the hospital significantly less, and costs come down. So hospitals in Chicago and I think also Colorado are starting these pilot programs and finding it very effective, that when they pay the rent of these quote-unquote super users, people who are experiencing homelessness who end up in the ER over and over and over again, that it does it's not only the humane thing to do and good for the health of the patient, but also economically and fiscally, responsible because it cuts down on costs. So I thank you so much, Lindsay, for explaining kind of the context of how you got from where you were and from your background and to where you are now at VIP. That's a fascinating journey. Liz, can you tell us a little bit about what brought you here to VIP?
Sure. So I've been at VIP for about a year and a half now. And prior to VIP, I was working as a clinical professor in a law school in Virginia, working with veterans and VA disability benefits. So when I was there, I had a lot of clients who were experiencing homelessness, and I saw the effect that added income through disability benefits could have on someone's life. Like you said, I mean, homelessness is so disruptive to people moving. It makes them less able to access, legal services that they need. It's disruptive for the whole family. So coming back to Philadelphia, I was looking for an organization that focused on civil legal aid, and VIP really kind of drew me in with the mission and being, as we describe ourselves, an agency of last resort. So our clients, come from referring agencies, and when those referring legal agencies aren't able to help the client for some reason, we're really kind of the last stop for them. So that really drew me in, and really seeing the impact that a lack of housing can have on people has been very eye-opening. I've always wanted to do public interest work in law school. After law school, it's all I've ever done, and it's an eye-opening experience, and it's very impactful.
I imagine. Thank you so much for explaining that, Liz. And so you both are staff at VIP, but you mentioned that what VIP does is utilize the resources of volunteers who are lawyers who come and help clients. So are there other organizations like VIP in the city that are doing this work?
There are other legal aid agencies that use volunteers, but we're one of the few that exclusively uses volunteer attorneys. Most of our partner agencies do a mix of direct legal services and referral, but our focus is really on referring more cases. We're a small agency, so we refer more cases than we could ever possibly handle if we were each handling our own caseload.
Okay, and the lawyers who are volunteering, do they have to have a specific background in housing, tenant rights, or are they coming from a variety of different specialties?
They're coming from a variety of specialties.
Okay.
Some of our volunteer attorneys have no experience in landlord-tenant work or whatever area that they choose to volunteer in. We provide CLE trainings. Our staff.
I'm sorry, can you tell me what CLE is?
Sure. It's a continuing legal education. So attorneys need credits to maintain status as an attorney. So we give credits for trainings. We also, all of our staff are available 100% of the time to support our attorneys. So they can come in with no experience, a lot of experience. We'll train them, get them into court, and they can take any type of case, and we're available to help.
That's amazing.
So a lot of our volunteers work at big law firms. They're solo practitioners, people who have just graduated from law school and need experience, people who are at the other end of their career and retiring and just want to stay involved. So it's a huge variety of different volunteers.
Amazing. And can you give me some estimate of your caseload, of the capacity that you have? How many people do you think you might be helping? And how many volunteers do you see? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
We refer usually over 900 cases a year.
Okay.
That's multiplied by how many people are in the household. So I forget the number exactly, but somewhere around like 1,500 people that we're impacting each year. And then what was the second part of your question?
And about how many lawyers do you think
and we have about 1,500 lawyers in our system. But there are 10,000 lawyers in Philadelphia, so there is a huge potential to grow and continue to engage new volunteers and get new people involved.
Amazing. Okay. So that's incredible context. I'm grateful for both of you explaining that. Can you give us a little bit of background in terms of what happens like, walk us through this system? What happens when somebody becomes evicted? What does that look like for the tenant? And then what are you able to help them with? What are the resources available to them?
Yeah, so we have clients who are in court for evictions for a variety of reasons. It could be, one visit to the hospital that put them behind on 1 month of rent, and the landlord is now evicting them through the legal process. It could be because they've reported repairs that needed to be done in the household. So we see a variety of different reasons why people are being evicted. However, once they go through the court process, oftentimes they'll end up with some sort of judgment on their record, whether it's a judgment for just possession of the property or a money judgment that then goes on the credit report and can keep them from renting another property. Once that judgment is there, or once the court case is even filed, it remains there on public record in the court docket system. And can really impact their ability to rent again. So a lot of our clients, the vast majority, have trouble renting again, even when they're able to get good or better outcomes with an attorney representing them in court. And when attorneys are representing tenants in court, and currently the stats are 80% of landlords are represented and only 10% or less of tenants are represented in court, tenants do get better results with representation, whether that's negotiating a few more months in the property, which enables them to have more time to find another property, or being able to negotiate a payment plan that's reasonable and they're able to pay. But again, once that eviction has been filed, it's record with the court. And something our attorneys do after these court hearings is we'll often try to petition the court to vacate or satisfy the judgment so that it is removed from a credit reporting agency or other reporting mechanisms that landlords use. But the issue and the common phrase that's been used is the Scarlet E is a very permanent and real effect on tenants in Philadelphia and keeps them from renting other properties.
I see this all the time with my organization, SRE Hub, standing for Student Run Emergency Housing Unit of Philadelphia. And we are an organization of partnering with all the local universities, and we have been providing shelter for people experiencing homelessness since 2011. Our goal was to link people to resources and then be able to get them into housing. And that part of getting them into housing became significantly harder over the years. When basically a little bit of background in terms of homelessness, a lot of money used to go into the shelter system. And in the early 2000s, Dennis Colhane, who was a professor at Penn, started writing articles making a financial case, a case saying that it was economically effective to be able to give people housing than to let them stay and potentially die homeless or in the homeless shelter system. He compared people in a shelter in New York with people who were given housing in New York and found that it was a cost savings of about $7,000 per year for taxpayer, per person housed for the taxpayer. So advocates had been making the case for years that it was the more humane thing to house people than to let them be in the shelter system. But once Dennis Colhane and others could make the case that it was also economically effective for taxpayers to house them, that's when housing started to become policy. So in 2008 is when we see the beginning of policy related to housing first, this idea that there would be financial help in the form form of voucher, Section 8 housing, to get people rental assistance. However, there was at the time the gateway to accessing those vouchers or the rental assistance was the shelter system. So people who'd been living in substandard housing, doubled up in housing or living in cars or abandoned buildings, started coming out from wherever they were and going into the shelter with the hope that they could get rental assistance. So what ends up happening is that at the very same time that shelters are being defunded because of a lot of the original federal funding for shelters is redistributed away from shelter and to housing, they make the shelter the gateway, so put this added burden on the shelter, and shelters, because they couldn't manage that burden with a lack of resources, started to close. And we see this in Philadelphia in 2008. In 2011, the Ridge shelter closed, which was one of the largest shelters in Philadelphia, housing over 300 people, but they were financially strapped. So my shelter opened in 2011, the same time Ridge shelter closed, and we only had capacity for about 30. But we started working with Pathways to Housing and other partners who would help with the rental assistance on the back end. However, as the housing prices have increased dramatically in Philadelphia, and the vouchers have not, the money for the vouchers and the Section 8 housing have not increased, what we are seeing is that there's decades-long wait list for housing. And in addition to that, while the cost of housing from 2015, I think, to 2017, there was a jump of cost of housing by about 40%, wages have been stagnant. So we're also seeing that Pennsylvania has not had a rise in minimum wage since 2009. It's at $7.25, which is also the federal minimum wage. States can pay more, but they can't pay less than that. So wages are stagnant, and what we also have is about we have the cost of living has gone up about 13% in that time. And so rent is becoming, people are becoming rent burdened, right? Economically, rental housing affordability is 30% of income or less, right? But in Philadelphia, over 80% of people who are living below the poverty line are paying more than 50% of their income on housing. So Liz, to your point, if somebody is behind 1 month, it's very easy for that to happen. Because if they're already living on the edge, if they're already paying over 50% of their income on rent, and they have one incident, maybe somebody gets sick, or they need to take time off work for any reason, or lose their job or anything, they'll fall behind, and this becomes kind of a vicious cycle, which can lead to homelessness, and with an eviction on their record, become almost impossible for them to get housing again. So I just wanted to give a little bit of context into kind of the mechanisms behind it and what's happening economically that is leading, I think, to more evictions. So when we come back from our break, which we're about to take, we'll talk a little bit more about what VIP does for clients when they come to you, what this looks like, and what kind of some of the tenant rights are that maybe tenants aren't even aware of, and how we can raise awareness for what tenant rights are in the city. So stay tuned. We'll be back shortly after this short break. Thanks. Okay. Thank you. I'm sorry.
If you love them enough to suck the snot out of their nose at 4 a.m., then surely you'll check NHTSA.gov/the right seat to make sure they're in the right car seat.
Being prepared is a part of who you are, but it's especially important in the case of a disaster. Be informed about possible emergencies in your area. Make a plan that covers where you'll go in an emergency. Build a kit with the things you need to survive. There's no one more capable of planning for your situation than you. Start your plan today. Go to ready.gov/myplan.
Hi, and welcome back to Thinking Constellationally, where we connect the dots between systems of inequity and between ourselves and our neighbors. Today, my guests are Lindsay Schoonmaker and Liz Tarlowski, who are staff at VIP, Philadelphia's nonprofit organization that helps people who are facing or have faced evictions and help people who are struggling with housing and housing discrimination. So thank you so much, Lindsay and Liz, for being here and talking about this important subject with us. Lindsay, before we took our break, you had mentioned that VIP manages about 900 cases a year, not all tenant-client cases, but around 900 cases, and that represents a much larger picture. Approximately 1,500 people are affected, and that's not a small number. In terms of Philadelphia at large, we have approximately, actually, I think the numbers right now are about 16,000 people experiencing homelessness throughout the year, but there's only about 1,200 shelter beds in the city. So we are at overcapacity for shelter beds. I'm actually today between 1:30 and 3, I'm going to a HUD meeting about the homeless count, which I think, I don't know if you know much about the point in time census. I happen to think that it's really flawed. So I'm very much looking forward to HUD talking about the point in time count. But our actual numbers for how many people are facing homelessness, my perspective is that it's probably significantly higher than any of the numbers that we actually have. And part of the reason why I think that's higher is because I think that it's in cities' best interest to underestimate those numbers, because in order to get HUD funding for issues of homelessness, cities have to demonstrate that they're making market improvement every year. And so and this homelessness, is multifaceted. But if we have an increase in homelessness from year to year, we're not seeing that, mostly because if cities reported that accurately, it might lead to a decrease in funding to the cities. So there are so many people affected by this, and I do think actually a large portion of them are affected with this because of evictions. So can you maybe talk, Liz and Lindsay, a little bit about what that looks like for the client once you mentioned, Liz, that somebody can fall behind on their rent and then an eviction is started in the courts. So then what happens, and what happens when they come to VIP or are directed to VIP?
Sure. So someone will get a notice likely posted on their door, okay, or handed to an adult who lives in the property. It doesn't have to be the person on the lease. It is then considered served if they're handed this court paper or it's posted on their door. In large apartment buildings, it's not necessarily posted on their door. It might be posted on an entryway door that they don't use. A lot of people, there's a lot of issues on notice of a court proceeding against you in the landlord-tenant world, and a lot of advocates are working on improving the service requirements to make sure people actually have notice that they're about to be evicted.
So do you believe that there's then many people who are facing eviction but are not aware that they're facing eviction? And what problems can result because of that, Lindsay?
So once the landlord files, there will be a hearing about 3 to 5 weeks later. Probably closer to 3. I mean, it's a very short time frame from when it's filed to when you find out, and that is if you find out. So if you find out, you have about 3 weeks until the hearing, and then you would go to a hearing. If you don't find out and you do not show up at a hearing, or you've found out but you are a non-English speaker and don't understand what the court papers say, you might be illiterate and not understand what the papers say, it might just be really confusing because it's in legal jargon.
It also might be really difficult to get to court, right? I mean, people could potentially lose work and income that they desperately need.
Yeah,
so there might be a lot of obstacles, but one of them is potentially that they don't know. And my guess would be that it would be in the landlord's interest to make this as confusing as possible, because what happens if a tenant shows up at court or does not show up at court for the hearing? What happens in that case?
It's a lot easier on the landlord. A default judgment is entered if someone is not there to say present when their case is called. And it's a scary process even when you get into the municipal court building. It's like a roll call, cattle call. Everybody's in this room. The commissioner comes up and reads a script, but then starts calling out the cases, and you have to be present and understand that you need to say that you're present. And so if you are not, a judgment can be entered against you. That judgment will then be mailed to your address. So if you are still living in the property, you might get that in the mail. If you're not still living in the property, you might find out years later that you had this judgment against you and it's affecting your credit or potential housing in the future. Otherwise, a sheriff will then show up 21 days later to lock you out. The landlord-tenant officer, it's actually outsourced in Philadelphia. But so up to 21 days later.
Wait, I'm sorry. Can you explain what you just said, that the tenant landlord officer is...
Normally in the Court of Common Pleas, if there's some kind of ejectment action, which is not a landlord-tenant relationship, it's a different type of relationship where someone is in a property but there is no landlord-tenant relationship, it would actually be the Philadelphia Sheriff's Office that comes out to lock you out after the court proceeding. Okay. In landlord-tenant court, so many of these were happening that I, from what my understanding is, they outsourced it to this landlord-tenant officer, who is someone that the city pays to run an office that will affect these evictions. And so what it is someone will come out, hand the paperwork to the person who is being evicted. They will have about 5 minutes to gather up essential papers, medicine, really important things, and to get out of the property. The property will then be locked by this landlord-tenant officer, and the tenant cannot get back in without writing to the landlord within 10 days, to have then 30 days to get back in one time to remove all of their belongings at once.
Yeah, and so thank you so much, Lindsay, for clarifying that. I want to take a minute to explain a little bit about how that affects a person dealing with this. So there's a family who has been staying with me for quite some time as we look for permanent housing for them. And it's a mother and her 2 daughters. Her daughters are 10 and 12. And so she originally became homeless, was in the shelter system for over 18 months as she waited for a Section 8 voucher, or rather rapid rehousing assistance, which was only to last for 12 months. So rental assistance through the rapid rehousing program for 12 months. And so she worked with TURN, which is another nonprofit agency, which is supposed to be a tenant advocate nonprofit agency. And I believe part of the problem that we have with rental identification, so services like TURN that help tenants find rental places, is that the Urban Institute, which is another nonprofit, does all this research on housing discrimination and has determined that in Philadelphia, about 64% of landlords discriminate against clients who have rental assistance, even though that's illegal. But there's not a lot of mechanism for regulating it or following up on it, or punishing any landlords for doing that. So it's left to a lot of nonprofits to manage. And so about 64% of landlords discriminate, will not take a housing voucher. So people who have rental assistance because they need it often can't find housing. What I believe is happening is then there is a demand for rental properties for landlords that do take it, and those people are in a minority, and I think that they have the majority of that housing for low income clients who have these vouchers or rental assistance of any type. And because there's such a high demand, I think that those landlords are getting away with a lot because they're profiting off of that market of people who have this housing voucher. So landlords have said to me before, it's very complicated and costly and difficult to evict a tenant. And I think that potentially for small landlords who maybe own one or two properties, I'm not sure, but this could be more complicated than a scenario in which a landlord has a lot of properties and they contract with a service like Evictions Unlimited, which are these eviction services where the landlord rather, connects with that. There's a lawyer who does all of the cases. It's just a click and evict, easy, organization that does this. It becomes, I think, less cost prohibitive when you're doing it in this way. And so, for example, when Ebony, the woman who's living with me, when she became homeless, she got the rental assistance. She had this apartment that Turn sent her to, this Turn nonprofit that helps with housing identification. They helped her, but they connected her to Lublin Corporation Housing. And Bill Lublin is the owner of Century 21. And owns a lot of property in the city of Philadelphia. And he is one of the few landlords that will accept these vouchers. But online, you can find he's made a name for himself by doing a lot of workshops and lectures and talks on how to maximize profit in this industry, working specifically with low-income tenants. And so maximizing profit are things like, first of all, the house was in major disrepair. It didn't have baseboards or heat in the upstairs bedrooms. She called to have these repairs made, and there was no movement until she called L&I. Right, and L&I came out, licensing inspection came out and required that the landlord make these adjustments. And so there were repairs made, but it took a long time for them to be made. And then what happened is after 12 months, the rental assistance ran out. But that wasn't enough time to have her financially stabilized. She was working and continues to work about 3 jobs. One of them is as an aide in the Philadelphia school system working with students who have autism, and the other one is a hospice worker, but both are gig work. And in the gig economy, she doesn't have benefits. She is, really, it's unstable. So she she became financially burdened. The assistance ran out after a year. And once it ran out, Lublin increased the rent and then also recharged her security deposit. But at the same time, her father passed away. And she paid the rest of her funds that she had, and she didn't have many, to have him cremated and to get his ashes. She ended up being really not able to hold on to this housing. She was evicted through the system. She went through the system. She didn't have legal representation in court. She was scared. She didn't know what she was doing. And then the sheriff did come to lock her out and gave her this 5 minutes, as you were saying, Lindsay. And she had to grab, and what she grabbed, luckily for me, is that she grabbed a lot of her paperwork, which was vital, which has helped me kind of build a case for her and help her get housing. However, in that scramble to get things, what she ended up leaving behind is her father's ashes, which she had spent her last penny on. And then they ended up in the shelter system again, where they would have to wait maybe another 18 months or 2 years for another voucher to kick in. So these young children were in essence being raised in this shelter system where they had no privacy. There were no doors in the bedrooms of this family shelter. They had to be in the room with another family, a family of boys, where they had absolutely no privacy and are treated in essence like criminals. And I said I didn't want them to go back into the shelter system and let them stay with me. But as I've been trying to get them into housing, I have found that because of the evictions on their record, it is almost impossible. And the landlords who are faced, they have, because we're at this housing shortage and a shortage of low-income housing in Philadelphia, they have so many people applying for low-income housing. And so over and over again, we've applied. And every time we apply for housing, it's another $50 for an application, which in and of itself is cost prohibitive. Meanwhile, it's this mother working so many jobs, trying as hard as she can with these two daughters, and it seems almost an uphill battle, like just impossible. And it's overwhelming, and that's just one family and one story, and there's so many others. But I think it's vital to marry this information with the stories of the real people who are affected by that. Loveland Corporation, as Liz is mentioning, that even if you have these evictions evacuated, they're on the court records. So I went on the court record, which is easy. Anybody can do it. You can go and look at these eviction records. And I found Loveland Corporation had evicted 216 eviction cases in the courts. But they have a representation with Howard Ford, who was the one who's going and doing all these evictions. So Loveland never has to actually go to the courts. He never has to meet his tenants. They're just, numbers to him. So he doesn't get to hear the stories behind these people who are affected. And for each of those 216 cases in the courts, that's hundreds of other people, Lindsay, as you're mentioning, because it's not just Ebony who's evicted, but her daughters who are also evicted. So it's also all the family members who are affected. So that 216 cases could be hundreds and hundreds of people who, once they have an eviction, it becomes nearly impossible then to get into housing again. So I just want to, make clear to the listeners how really this case of evictions, this issue of evictions, I think is one of the biggest problems facing people, tenants, and people who are experiencing homelessness and poverty in Philadelphia today. So the work you are doing is so incredibly vital. So as you see people and you try to help them, what are the resources that you're able to connect them to? Or what are the volunteers' resources that they have available to them?
Yeah, once an eviction is filed in court, the resources are scarce. What I would love to see are more resources on the front end or alternatives to the eviction process. Sometimes it's just a matter of educating landlords about other ways, to either negotiate with tenants for move-out dates or payment plans. I believe there is a pilot program in Philadelphia right now that is testing out like a pre-eviction filing kind of mediation program so that the court doesn't have to get involved and that this, eviction doesn't have to be on the court docket at all. So unfortunately, once the eviction is filed, and I would also love to see some sort of, expungement of evictions, similar to how, Philly has passed the clean slate law a couple years ago, where now, certain arrests or a certain misdemeanor convictions are completely expunged from the record so that they're not visible. If we could do that with certain types of evictions, I think it would really increase tenants' ability to rent in the future.
So you mentioned education of landlords. So in terms of the things that you would like to see landlords have more knowledge of this process and of how it affects their tenants possibly, or maybe even tenant rights. I think education is vital, right? Are there, when we return, we'll talk a little bit more about education in terms of clients, of tenants, landlords, judges potentially, and how that education can be so vital to moving the needle. Thank you so much, Lindsay and Liz. We'll be right back after this short break. I'd love to
What do you think you're doing, Kevin?
Was just gonna drive home.
There are several warning signs present that you shouldn't be driving.
Like hearing voices?
Like your text-to-emoji ratio?
Oh man, the selfies. Selfie, nailed it.
We all have warning signs that let us know that we're probably not okay to drive. Mine is pretending to be your subconscious.
Craig, come on man, split a ride home.
150 over 90.
180 over 111.
160 over 110. I had a stroke.
This is what high blood pressure looks like. You might not feel its symptoms, but the results from a stroke are far from invisible or silent. If you've come off your treatment plan, get back on it, or talk with your doctor to create an exercise, diet, and medication plan that works for you. Go to loweryourhbp.org.
If I would have followed a treatment plan, I would not be in this situation.
Okay, thanks. And we're back on Thinking Constellationally, where we connect the dots between systems of inequity and between ourselves and our neighbors on USLA Media. And today we have our guests, Lindsay Schoonmaker and Liz Tarlowski, who are who work for VIP, a nonprofit that helps people who are. So the mission of VIP overall, it's not just for tenants and facing eviction.
It's all civil cases where someone could not get a free attorney any other way and can't afford to get an attorney.
Okay, so incredibly vital. So before we took the break, Liz you were mentioning a little bit about things that you would like to see that kind of put barriers and obstacles to tenants having resources that they need and remaining housed and in their house. So there are all these barriers. What would you like to see in terms of removing these barriers to people being able to access and remain in their homes?
Yeah, like I mentioned, I think education is really, really big. And education of not only tenants but landlords as well. Something we see a lot are illegal evictions. So in order to evict someone from their property as a tenant, you have to go through the legal process. A landlord can't send a tenant a 10-day notice, say, I want you out of the property, and then change the locks. They have to, file in court. So we see a lot of cases where, the tenant has been illegally locked out and they don't know what to do, or they can't afford to pay a locksmith to get back in. And I think there could be a lot more legal remedies or remedies enforced along the lines of illegal evictions. Technically, landlords should be subject to criminal penalties for it, and we just don't really see that happening in Philadelphia. Whether it's not a priority or what have you, it's just something that I think could use a lot more attention.
So important. So other than kind of raising awareness, and so you mentioned that there's all these illegal evictions that are happening and that there's not a lot of resources to be able to fight these illegal evictions or that they're not really followed up, I guess, very often. What other obstacles would you like to see removed?
Well, so I would say in good news, a lot of attention has been put on evictions in Philadelphia starting back in 2017, 2018. There were city council hearings, and so there's been more funding for representation of tenants in court. And part of that funding, it's the Philadelphia Eviction Prevention Project, and there's a bunch of legal aid agencies, but also non-legal agencies that are partnering and getting money from the city to help tenants. It's run by Community Legal Services, Philadelphia VIP, our agency is a part of it, Legal Clinic for the Disabled, Senior Law Center, and then Clarify provides financial counseling for tenants. So if a tenant gets to court and they're trying to negotiate an agreement, hopefully they will maybe have met with a financial counselor in advance or can ask quick questions to the financial counselor on call about what might be affordable when making that agreement. And then Turn, the organization that you mentioned earlier, is doing two pieces. They're providing a courtroom navigator in municipal court to sort of give people information about the court process. So, and then the other part is workshops, letting people know what their rights are. And the beautiful thing that we've been seeing about tenants knowing their rights is tenants know that you can legally withhold your rent. So there is a way, if the landlord is not providing habitable housing, which is something that we see in almost every single case that we get. A lot of people, because if you're having difficulty finding housing, you're willing to live in substandard conditions. And landlords who seem to have all of the power in this negotiation will convince a lot of people that they can they'll charge you less if you're willing to put up with no heat or no water or mold or raw sewage in the basement, all of these things we've seen. In fact, a landlord has to provide some basic level of habitability and cannot just charge less in order to give you that substandard housing. And it's great that we're providing a lot of information for tenants. Tenants are starting to realize that you can write a letter to your landlord. If your landlord's not fixing the issue, a tenant is legally allowed to withhold rent. A tenant is legally allowed to make the repair themselves and then take that money out of a rent payment. But the issue is when you start doing that, landlords then start getting angry. And so we see a lot of people who are getting sort of retaliation evictions because of taking those legal measures. So some of it is, I think one of the most difficult things that I feel when we're counseling clients is that you have to explain both what their legal rights are and what the practicalities of are in the situation, and what a landlord can do, how the unknowns of going to court, not knowing what the outcome might be despite having a good legal case. So there's just a lot of unknowns, and while a lot of progress has been made, there's still a lot of progress that we would like to see.
Okay, I love that. And thank you so much, Lindsay, for giving us a little clarification and context in terms of progress that's been made. Mm-hmm. And I'm seeing progress regularly. So there was just a bill passed in City Council, right, brought by Helen Gim to provide tenants with legal representation in the courts, mm-hmm. which prior you had mentioned that only about 10% of all tenants had this legal representation, where you mentioned 80% of landlords did. So now if these low-income tenants are, and when we talk about low income, we're really talking about practically almost a quarter of the entire population of Philadelphia is living below the poverty line. So that's not a small amount. And I hear people talking about how great the economy is doing, but I always wonder for who, right? And so yes, unemployment is down, but what we see are people like Ebony who have multiple jobs. None of them can help pay their rent and basic necessities. So we're talking about a lot of people, but this bill was just passed, and by a quarter, we're talking about practically between 300 and 400,000 people is what we're talking about when we say nearly a quarter, about 23% of the entire population of Philadelphia are living below the poverty line. So these low-income tenants now, through this bill that was passed, have this right to legal representation. Do you know when that starts?
It's going to be a long and probably slowly implemented process. It's not
overnight, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think it'll take a few years to fully implement it. There are 23,000 eviction filings a year in Philadelphia. Wow. How many of those would qualify for representation under the right to counsel? I'm not sure, but it's a massive undertaking in the city. Wow. So we're all so very excited about it, but to do it right, I think it'll take a little bit of time. New York, the way they've implemented it is, I believe, borough by borough, and it's been a couple years in the making. It's still not fully implemented yet. So
okay, this is such important context. And 23,000 evictions in Philadelphia, that's massive, especially as we've continued to say that represents so many more people. Potentially, 3 to 4 to 5 times that number of people who are affected by those evictions.
And those are only the legal evictions. That doesn't count all the illegal evictions that happen throughout the city.
So Matthew Desmond mentioned, Matthew Desmond is an author who wrote the book called Eviction, which was a really important book. So if listeners want to learn more, we highly recommend that they check out Matthew Desmond's book. Also, On the Media has podcast. On the Media is a great podcast altogether, but they have a podcast based on Matthew Desmond's work called The Scarlet E, a 4-part series on evictions, which I assign to my students because I find it to be so valuable. And Matthew Desmond mentioned in that podcast that there are then evictions that are even like not recorded or not legal, not, you know, kind of these off the record evictions. What is that about?
I mean, that's the case where a landlord just changes the locks or cuts off utilities. If they're cutting off electric, water, heat to a property, or even doing things that make a tenant feel unsafe in the property, so that without having to go through that legal process, the landlord gets the person to move out.
Okay.
That's not legal. It shouldn't be allowed. There should be criminal penalties for it, but it happens a lot. And in fact, in Philadelphia, one of the areas of the city that has the largest Spanish-speaking population, which is a low-income area, has some of the lowest numbers of eviction filings. So it's presumed that that area is one of the largest areas of illegal evictions.
Can you tell me what that area is?
There's a map of it.
Okay. That's fine, because there's an area that I know where the majority are Spanish speaking, and I see it constantly that there are these illegal evictions in that neighborhood.
I don't know the name of the neighborhood, but it's in the Northeast.
Okay. The neighborhood that I'm thinking of is around Port Richmond, but I'm seeing this specifically with Spanish speakers who are being evicted, and they come to my house and they show me, and it's clearly illegal, and they don't know their rights, and they often can't even speak English and understand what's happening to them. And I see this, pretty regularly.
I mean, for Spanish-speaking tenants, I would say it is nice that we have a one-sheet page that is supposed to be with every complaint that is filed and served on a tenant, that is in English and Spanish, saying where you should go when you receive this package to get legal help.
Vital. So can you talk a little bit more about some obstacles that we're currently facing in Philadelphia, and potential solutions, or, as Liz mentioned, what you would like to see happen in your world of, of dreams and hopes? What would you like to see?
Well, besides education, I mean, I think the expungements or some kind of sealing of these filings once they're resolved would be ideal. Court can be a bit of a circus and very overwhelming. I remember the first time I was in there as an attorney, I felt overwhelmed. And then, thinking about what a tenant is going through walking into court for the first time with, over 100 people in the room, only seeing attorneys representing landlords, making that process easier. The start time in the morning for court is 8:45 for the morning session. And, I've had clients tell me that interferes with, child care and getting kids to school. So making, I think, the court process less intimidating would be helpful. I mean, the right to counsel has passed, so once that's implemented, I think, having an attorney with you in court is really, really helpful and amazing for tenants, because, you have someone who knows the process, who can advocate on your behalf, and it really evens the playing field, because so many landlords are represented, with attorneys. And then, I mean, I wish we had more housing. I know in that podcast, the Scarlet E, they mentioned that, just building more housing isn't necessarily the solution. But I mean, I just wish there were more resources for people who have gone through this process to find stable and safe housing. If there were more if L&I was able to, enforce these violations, or enforce some kind of penalties against landlords, some kind of motivation for them to keep housing habitable and stable, because we will see the same property with multiple tenants in multiple different cases, because the tenant, might legally withhold rent, be evicted, repairs aren't made, and then we see the same thing happen in the same property. So, what is the motivation for the landlord to fix that property if they can just get somebody else in there at the same amount and then evict them once they start complaining?
Right, because there is a never-ending supply of people who are low income in the city and need desperately are needing of housing, and in that situation, they're incredibly vulnerable, and there's a power dynamic there in which the landlord is able to take advantage of them. I have spoken to landlords who feel like so that the bill was just passed mandating that landlords manage bed bug problems, right, in Philadelphia. When I talk to landlords, they feel burdened by this. And there are certain landlords who are running at very slim profit margins, and who are cost burdened themselves. And so if they have one or two properties where they rent, if their tenant falls behind on a property, on a rent rather, or if they have to put in this extra cost of bed bug removal, that could be the difference in them paying their mortgage on time, right? And so that's happening. Although I do feel that those landlords, while there are many of them, the majority of our housing inventory is concentrated in the hands of these corporations or people who own multiple housing, and they have huge profit margins. So I think that while there are many of these small landlords who are cost burdened, I think that that potentially, and maybe there can be some kind of system in which evictions are more expensive and certainly more difficult for those landlords who have the majority of these housing of low income housing in their disposal. But I think that I wonder. I personally think what we're seeing right now with housing and homelessness is actually not a broken system. It's a system that's operating exactly as it's meant to. It's capitalism operating exactly as it's meant to, and that is a broken system. And so when you have housing that's in the private market, and about 80% of people who are low income are in the private market, when housing is made as profit and not as a human right, then you're going to constantly have these issues where, try as we do, these solutions which are vital, in essence, are Band-Aid solutions if we don't look at the greater problem in the bigger system, which is that housing is in a marketplace where it should be a human right, as it is, healthcare, which is a human right, but we can look at housing as healthcare. And without housing, without basic housing and basic healthcare, that is going to lead to death for so many of our neighbors. It already is. We have the homeless memorial coming up next week, and every year we're losing people in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love and sisterly love, to people who don't have proper housing and access to housing. And until we address, I think, systemic issues of the economy and housing in the marketplace, I think we're going to continue to have these issues. But the progress that VIP is making in terms of representing clients, education workshops, I think is so vital. And I've seen this work. I've seen tenants who benefit from it, and for them it's life or death, really. So what you're doing is incredible. I think so. At Villanova, I teach at the Center for Peace and Justice, and I teach courses on poverty, but my students, many of them go on to be lawyers, and I always say, we need more of you. We need more Liz's and Lindsay's and people who are working on the front lines.
Well, and we need them to become private practitioners and then do pro bono work and volunteer for us and take on cases.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lindsay, for mentioning that. So that is our message today, is we need more lawyers, more help with this, more resources, and more awareness. Thank you so much, Liz and Lindsay, for coming on the show and talking to us about what you do and the impact it has. It's vital, and I'm grateful to both of you for strengthening the safety net in Philadelphia for our neighbors who are in a vulnerable situation. Thank you both so much.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, that's it, and we'll be back next week for another episode of Thinking Constellationally. Thanks for listening. Bye.